thank you to all of you who are here today. We're here today to listen to Lynne Hale, who is this year's Graduate School Oceanographer awardee for, was it the Lifetime Achievement Award that's given out by the URI Foundation. So we're very proud and happy for Lynne. So maybe we can give her a round of applause. So maybe, I don't know if you all read Lynne's bio, and probably all of you know her already, but as you probably know, she graduated from GSO just a few years back. And then after that, I don't know, I guess you worked maybe a little bit at URI, then you went to Alaska for a while. Then she was recruited by Stephen Olson to come and lead CRC's international program. She was one of the masterminds. And as we heard during lunch, she hired many of us at CRC, including myself. We all became one of Lynne's little chickens. And I think once you're a Lynne chicken, you'll be one for life. So something I wear with a proud badge. And then anyway, so she was with us until about 2000 or so. 2002. And then she left and became the founding director for the TNC's Global Marine Program. So she's here today to talk to us about her, I guess, lifetime of achievements and any lessons learned, perhaps. So welcome, Lynne.
Thanks, Elin. I've been called a mother hen many times, sometimes with compliments and sometimes not with compliments. So thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I feel like super humbled by all of this and kind of privileged to have the chance to kind of look back on what you tried to do over the last 30 or 40 years of your life. But I'm going to focus on the early years of marine conservation at the Nature Conservancy, because that's what I was tasked to do. And there's so many people here who can talk about the Coastal Resources Center and are telling its story now. But you'll hear a little bit about that, because as all journeys are, what happens when it's important to prepare for your journey and to think about what you're doing before leaving shore. And that can be the difference between success and failure. And my journey definitely started here at CRC. We had talked about this trailer a little bit at lunch. I was a student of Dr. Sastry, someone who I can't even remember when he left GSO. I was working on juvenile lobsters, and I wasn't sure that was really going to be my life's work. And I was in the Butler building, which I thought was closed, but actually I just walked by it, and apparently it isn't closed, but it's perhaps, Bob, it should be closed. Oh dear, well, I hope you're as lucky as I am in finding neighbors outside. And I started visiting the two gentlemen who basically were the Coastal Resources Center back then, Stephen Olson and Malcolm Grant. They had been charged by then Dean Knaus to help the newly established Coastal Management Council develop its coastal management program. And he told them, just translate the science into management and all will be well. So upon graduating from GSO in 1975, I was fortunate to get my first job at CRC. And I became part of the pioneering team. Steve, Malcolm, Don is here, some others, to draft the first Rhode Island Coastal Zone Management Program. And it was required by the federal government that it have a public participation program. Public participation was a new concept back then. And we were kind of inventing how are we going to do it as we went along. And boy, did we learn a lot. One of the things we learned is always eat before a public meeting. That was lesson number one. But we held about 50 public meetings on different aspects of the plan. We had one-on-one meetings with anyone who wanted to meet with us, a process that now CRC does routinely, but then it was quite new. And I learned a lot from that. I learned that while science was absolutely central, facts matter, facts are critical, science is critical, but unless you have the kind of broad support of the people who are going to be managed, your plan doesn't have a snowball's chance of existing in the real world. So that was kind of lesson number one. In '78, as Elin said, my husband Stephen and I left Rhode Island for what we thought was going to be a short adventure in Alaska, and turned out to be about 7 years. And I was lucky to get awarded something that the National Science Foundation then had, which were called Public Service Science Residencies. And they paid for a scientist to work with an organization that was involved with environmental or other kinds of technical problems, issues, but didn't have the expertise in-house to really deal with it. And I got to work with the Northwest Alaska Native Association region on a whole variety of issues. And the NANA region, as it's called, was a 35,000 square mile region with 7,000 people in 11 villages, almost all Inupiat, and subsistence fishing, hunting, and gathering wasn't just their tradition, it was why they still lived there. It was a central part of their lives. So this place obviously was a little different than Rhode Island, and I learned a lot. I got to work on all kinds of issues. I worked on coastal management. I worked on reindeer herding and how to make that operation more efficient and also more environmentally friendly. I worked on commercial fisheries, and I learned how to work a little bit more in cultures that were different than my own. I learned that in a place where cultures are very strong, that has to be at the center of what management is. I kind of learned that in those remote places, leadership matters, as it always matters, but leaders in those kinds of places were always, always overstretched, underappreciated, needed support, and the next generation of leaders were hardly ever identified and mentored and managed, and that's something that they need. Then in 1985, I came back to Rhode Island to work with Steve and the whole crew working on what was just a beginning coastal management program. And the objectives of that first program are listed up here. I'm not going to read them, but we basically worked with other countries. We tried to apply what experience we had to those countries, advance the state of the art, and really establish a center in the United States that could work with countries around the world to help them solve their problems. And I mean, I feel like at lunch, we had lunch with a lot of CRCers, and what they're doing today totally, totally verifies that those goals weren't just met back then. I mean, Rhode Island, CRC and URI really is recognized as a leader in this field and probably the leader, although one always has to be careful about claiming the leadership. But I'm not going to talk much about this because there's many people in this room who can and will talk more about this. I'm just going to say that when I left CRC, I really left with a treasure chest of experience, of lessons, and most importantly, a rich network of colleagues who continue to be part of my professional and personal life today. And you know, I'll mention just maybe one or two lessons from then, and who knows what the most important ones are. But among them, we're really needing to work at many tracks. You can't just work locally. You can't just work nationally. You can't just work internationally. If you really want to solve the big problems, you need to work at all of those levels. And I learned that while progress is often very incremental, has lots of setbacks, but when you have continuity of purpose and a dedicated team, over the long term, progress is going to be made. And that kind of motivates everything. So in January of 2003, I started working at the Nature Conservancy, and it was the first time I worked for an environmental NGO, which is, you know, a very different kind of organization than a university. But I really was attracted to the Nature Conservancy, both by its values and kind of by how it works. While it's not confrontational, it does its work based on science, and a lot of great scientists work for the Nature Conservancy. And it had a global presence as well as strong chapters in the US. But it also had some new things that you don't have at a university. It could take a lot of risks in the real world and innovate in projects in the real world. And importantly, it had resources to put behind those projects, that it prided itself in be able to put, if you will, skin in the game to try to make something happen. And that was a new tool for me. But TNC really hadn't done much marine, but it hadn't done nothing. So there were some small projects in Indonesia and in the Pacific, largely around community-based marine protected areas. A lot of the coastal state chapters had some restoration projects. It had, you know, as every big organization does, people who love the ocean scattered around the organization. But there was also some skepticism and concern within the organization that, you know, TNC, which is so well known for buying land, having preserves, that it really didn't have much to offer the marine world. So our job was to kind of prove that wrong. So this is going to be a small diversion, because when I first started working there, a project happened right south of us in Long Island Sound that just blew my mind, that about TNC had just acquired about the submerged bottom, about 20% of Great South Bay in fee simple title. So here we were, submerged landowners of a really important bay. And we got that through a gift of land, just like, you know, many lands are done. And with that ownership, we were able to really start addressing a situation that's not uncommon in many of the bays, a demise of the clam fishery that had gone from, I think it was 700,000 barrels down to basically nothing. And there had been really lots of talk, but no real tangible efforts to rebuild the clam fishery. And by owning the bottom, we were able to form a stakeholder group with participation, but we were able to overcome the resistance of closing certain areas to fishing, being able to reseed them and restore them. And through that process, start generating, you know, the positive feedback loops that something could be done in this bay. And that program's been going on for 25 years now, you know, going from issue to issue. But what inspired me was like, wow, I'm in an organization that can, you know, see a problem and jump right in and do something about it with tools I had never been able to work with before. So now back to launching the program. So ocean challenges, you know, we all know what they are in this room, and they were the same when I started there, and they're the same today, only more so. So it wasn't a question of defining the problems. It was a question of what can the Nature Conservancy do to make a difference here and get started. So we decided, given our strengths and where we had capacity, was to really focus on protecting and restoring critical habitats. And we would start with reefs, coral reefs in the tropics and shellfish reefs in temperate areas. For people in this room, I'm not going to go into the importance of reefs. You guys all know that stuff. And I'll start with coral. So, you know, remember I started at the Nature Conservancy in the early 2000s. And some people here will remember that in 1998, there was a massive global coral bleaching event. And that kind of bleaching started happening in a recurrent way after that. And the coral reef world was deep into doom and gloom. And a lot of work was going on, monitoring and documenting the decline and death of coral reefs. On my team, I had a wonderful person named Rod Som leading our coral reef work. And Rod took a different approach. He kept us squarely focused on the sometimes 2%, sometimes 5%, sometimes 10% of corals in a reef that did not die from the coral bleaching, and to really work hard on understanding and discovering what were the factors that either kept them from bleaching or enabled them to recover quickly. Some of those factors are there, but what was wonderful about working in a place like TNC is that in addition to the researchers, we had the on-the-ground practitioners. So you could say, this is what we're learning. How can we apply that to MPA design, network design? And we had wonderful partners in Palau, which is an island in the Pacific that has always had a strong conservation focus. And they also have an International Coral Reef Center, so they became our major partner for both the research on resilience, and then they had passed back in the early 90s a National Marine Protected Area Network bill, and as they implemented it, they became kind of the test case for incorporating kind of the resilience principles that Rod and others and the team had discovered, and through that kind of see what works, what didn't, and try to come out with principles for managing reefs in a way that promotes resilience. There was huge, because we're a global team, our job also was to take what we learned in one place and try to work with our other chapters and projects around the world to apply those lessons. And we did that with the resilience principles. But the coral crisis was huge, and we weren't obviously the only people trying to work on this. NOAA had a large coral reef conservation program, and we partnered with them to form the Reef Resilience Network back in 2007. And it was meant to be an open access hub that new knowledge and experience could be rapidly disseminated to the field. There could be exchange among practitioners as they were learning, so they could see what worked, what didn't work, what held promise in their areas. And I'm super proud to say that this network still exists today, 16 years later, which is astonishing for people who have run networks, and by now have trained practitioners in 3/4 of the 103 countries and territories with coral reefs. So it's really kind of wonderful to see. Okay, I'm going to move on to scale. So we talked about scale, and scale matters. You know, a lot of work goes into creating a community-based coastal marine protected area and network. But, you know, the ocean is big. There's a lot of coral reefs, and getting to scale is important. But to do that requires, you know, really bold vision, a lot of ambition, and political leadership and will that's maintained. And in Micronesia, which is, you know, part of the Pacific Ocean that's, you know, what they call large ocean countries, because they're tiny little islands surrounded by a lot of ocean and totally depend on the ocean for their well-being. Those leaders got together in 2006, and with some help and support from the Nature Conservancy, and set themselves a challenge of meeting some pretty ambitious goals for marine and terrestrial protection. And at the same time, they set a goal for how to sustainably finance those protected areas. And their success since then has been pretty amazing. Between 2006 and 2019, among them, they did 70 new protected areas, and they raised $85 million that included endowments for the protected areas that they did. They looked at what they'd accomplished in 2019 and expanded their challenges, saying, okay, we're going to ratchet up. We did this, now it's time to ratchet up, not just about protection, but let's set goals for livelihoods, fisheries, and climate change adaptation. And this idea got copied or replicated in a couple of places because other leaders saw this both as a way to bring attention to issues and also as a way to bring resources to issues. So the Caribbean Challenge got launched in 2008. And while it's easy to think these kinds of things end up with big summits, photo ops, empty promises, nothing happens, but they really do, with fits and starts, they do make a difference. So here's the Caribbean protected areas in 2008. Here they are in 2022, significantly more. The increase in protected areas was about 66,000 square kilometers, which is 3 New Jerseys. So and importantly, over each time the leaders would get together to review progress, a certain competition exists, which really helps to keep momentum. The Coral Triangle in Asia did a similar initiative. They focused on very directly from the start on food security and livelihoods, and with protection as a supporting mechanism for those societal goals. And again, that's moving forward. I want to point out 2 things on this slide. First, one is the huge number of partners, right? So it's really easy for the partners to say, we did this, we did that, and all of us have played a role. But what's really important in all these things is to remember it's the country's projects, it's the country's resources, and it's the countries who deserve the credit for their protection. And the role of the Nature Conservancy and the role of other partners was to provide support, and the support that the country needed. Sometimes that support was financial, sometimes it was scientific, sometimes it was legal, and sometimes it was just accompanying them and keeping the spirits up and keeping the political will there and creating events that kept the political will and momentum going. All right, so I'm going to move away from coral reefs to temperate estuaries, where we focused on oyster reefs. And oyster reefs used to dominate both the northern and southern hemispheres. And that map from Hargis 1999 is the best rendering of what oyster reefs looked like when the first European settlers came to America. And apparently they were major navigation hazards. Okay, that obviously is not the case. Oysters have been harvested to degrees that are almost unimaginable. I mean, this is a pile, this is really true. It doesn't seem like it could be, but they were harvested, their shells were then burned for lime, so they weren't returned to the estuary where they're needed to have settlement. So the decline of oysters and importantly, the services they provide have been decimated. It was something that we were paying attention to, but there really wasn't much of a quantification of the problem. And so a team of our scientists led by Mike Beck, who some of you know, pulled together a global assessment of what had happened to shellfish reefs. And as you can see from this diagram, they were gone. His global estimate back in 2011 was about 85% of the world's oyster reefs were just gone, functionally extinct. But TNC and many other groups had been doing small-scale demonstration projects on shellfish reef restoration and oyster restoration. And we'd learned a lot about how to do it. And restoring oysters was something where it's known pretty well how to do. But in order to make a difference at an ecosystem scale, we needed to, up the ante. We needed targets, and we needed a lot more funding than demo projects could provide. So 2009 was like a big year for us on shellfish reefs. Some of our scientists, some of the guys you know here, Bose Hancock, Brian DeAngelis, and Rob Brumbaugh, who used to be here, started working on how much reef is enough for the different services that we want from reefs, for fish habitats, for filtration, to stabilize the shore. And you can see what, we have a long way to go, but you start getting services when you start restoring at scale. But of equal importance, in 2009, if you guys will recall, it was a bad time for the economy, and there was a stimulus package passed. And for the first time, green infrastructure was included in the stimulus package, thanks to some very good lobbying by not only TNC, by the Save the Bays, Restore America's Estuaries, all the coastal people. And $167 million was made available for restoration projects. And the drafters were worried there wouldn't be enough projects to meet that need. Well, in very short order, 800 shovel-ready projects were submitted for funding that totaled $3 billion, and 50 were funded. We implemented quite a number of them. And again, the Global Marine Team, one of our roles was to support the projects and promote learning. So this is just one of the projects that was supported in Mobile Bay, and it aimed to restore and enhance shoreline habitat. And they upped their ambition to 100 miles of shoreline, 1,000 hectares of marsh restored behind it. And they've been at it now for 20 years. And thanks to my husband, I learned that they just got the Coastal and Estuarine Research Federation Stewardship Award for their 20 years of building green breakwaters that protect the shoreline and make habitat. So again, persistence and continuity matter. And so one of the things we did was look at how many jobs per $1 million spent did gray infrastructure versus green infrastructure create. And as you can see from here, natural infrastructure looks really, really good in terms of dollars invested versus jobs created. And this knowledge is now fairly widely accepted. And in these two big appropriation bills that were passed in the last 4 years, substantial amounts of funds have been allocated for green infrastructure and restoration. And this has enabled the start of bigger projects and working with partners who typically haven't been involved with this. So using green infrastructure for both environmental benefits and the economy, I think at least the US is now a little bit more mainstream than it used to be, and that's a good thing. As we were working on coastal habitats, we started really thinking of additional ways to build the case for their conservation and restoration. And so we started paying a lot more attention to the variety of ecosystem services that habitats provide. In 2013, when I say we, again, it's always with a big host of partners, and I apologize for not putting a million logos on every single slide. We started a project called Mapping Ocean Wealth, where we both mapped and valued in those maps a variety of services that the different habitats provide. The project is ongoing, and anyone who's interested in ecosystem services and coastal habitat should visit the website. But I'm going to talk a little bit about our coastal protection work. The general knowledge that coastal ecosystems protect shorelines is pretty well known, but we wanted to go a step further and really look at it through an engineering lens. And so we teamed up with some engineer colleagues and really looked hard at how much wave reduction, both in terms of energy and wave height, you get from a coral reef. And it turns out you get a lot, that close to the, all of the wave energy is reduced and a lot of the wave height. If the crest of the reef is intact. So we also then started looking at how much avoided damage did you have? So if the reef works, how much less destruction do you have on the shoreline? So by having both the importance of the reef and the value of what was behind it, we all of a sudden had enough information to have real conversations with people conservationists don't usually talk to, and that was insurance companies. So we started talking to insurance companies about the value of reefs as breakwaters. And that conversation brought us to Cancun, because Cancun has plenty of coastal property, and that property is largely protected by a coral reef that is surrounds it. And the hurricanes that go through can damage the reef. And when the reef is damaged, you get about twice as much loss in the coastal area. And we also learned that after a hurricane comes through and damages a reef, there's a lot that first responders can do, that if you pick up pieces of reef, sometimes they'll survive more. You can cement reef back on it. So there is a whole technology of how can you rapidly recover at least portions of a reef that have been damaged. But the problem was you need funds to pay these first responders, and you need them quickly. So out of that, the idea of insurance for coral reefs were born. And with a lot of work by a lot of different people, the Cancun reef became the first reef to be insured against storm damage. And while that diagram shows you some of the details, and I'm happy to go into them if anyone wants to know, the important piece of the insurance policy is that damages were paid out based on wind speed, based on the storm, not based on a damage assessment, which a lot of other disasters, that's how they work. The money after an oil spill, you do a damage assessment and it takes years and then money flows. Here, the payout was to be based on how strong the hurricane was. So in October 7th of 2020, Hurricane Delta hit Cancun. It was strong enough to trigger a payout. The payout was $850,000. That money was used to restore the reef. It paid for what we called a reef brigade to get out and start picking up pieces of broken coral reef and putting them back on. And that policy has been renewed year by year, and it's paid for by the Hotel Association, because it's a much cheaper response than building a concrete breakwater. So there's been a lot of interest in this idea of insuring natural infrastructure. The first US insurance policy for a reef was bought for Hawaii just a year ago. And in that case, TNC purchased the policy, and people are looking at this insurance approach in a variety of places now. Okay. All right, now I'm going to turn to fisheries pretty quickly. We got into fisheries kind of later than we got into habitat, because we were looking for a way where our approach, kind of non-confrontational, working with people who work the land and sea, wanting to see fisheries happen, but happen in a way that was more sustainable. And our California team kind of did a project that captured a lot of how TNC approaches conservation. Just like the clam fishery, I'm looking at Jeremy smiling. Another fishery collapsed a year ago, and and as part of the rebuilding plan, NMFS wanted to close a lot of the area to trawling, and it was very, very contentious, very litigious. Everyone was having a hard time coming up with a rebuilding plan, and our team sort of saw some opportunity in all this chaos. And they worked with the California Trawler Group and in kind of a quid pro quo arrangement, saying, if you work with us to come up with a plan that we can together put forward to the Fisheries Council, we'll buy out any fishermen who want to leave the fishery. We'll buy their permits. And so we ended up with the trawlers putting together a proposed, jointly petitioning the council to close a specific 3.8 million acres of important maritime marine habitat, and did enough of a buyout to reduce the trawl capacity in the project area by 50%. So all of a sudden TNC owned all these permits, and we're thinking, aha, TNC now owns permits. But our goal was not to close the fishery. Our goal was to change the harvest model with our permits. So what we did is we started leasing them back to fishermen, but we leased them back with conditions, just like you would a conservation easement. And we leased back with gear restrictions. We leased back with even further kind of area restrictions, saying if you're going to fish our permits, they have to be fished in such and such an area. And we required monitoring. And all of that allowed us to do adaptive management. We also de-risked kind of a lot of these changes for the fishermen, because we leased them back at very, very favorable rates, because again, our goal was to kind of turn the fishery around. And by 2011, we were the largest quota holder in this fishery. But our goal, again, was not to be in the fishing business. And I'm not going to go through all the different things, but by 2020, the fishery model had changed. There was mostly hook and line and trap fishing, trawling in just a small area. And we started divesting our permits, and now hold no permits, and divested them to a permit bank that makes them available for local fishermen to buy. And so the fishery has stayed local. It's been transformed. It's starting to rebuild. So it's a very happy story. And that really kind of got us into the world of fishing in a lot of the places we work on a variety of projects, but being very clear that when we work with fishermen, our interest is more fish, more seafood, stable jobs, and a healthy ocean. It's not to shut down fisheries. So I feel like this is my life. Here we go. In 2014, I stepped down as the lead for the Global Marine team, but I was lucky in that they let me stay at TNC for another 3 years, and was a senior conservation fellow, which meant I didn't have any management responsibilities, and I just got to work on cool projects. So a couple of the cool projects I worked on was we were starting country programs in Australia and New Zealand, and to figure out what would the marine component be in those programs. And they were really different from the other country programs, because these were, countries with very, very high capacity in marine science and marine conservation. They were mature, they had plenty of capability, and what could the Nature Conservancy add? And there was also concern, here's this big organization coming in, are they gonna suck up all the donors and funders? And so we tread carefully, and we spent a lot of time talking, a lot of time listening, a lot of time sharing what we did and how we did it, to see what would result in us being welcome, what would result in our making a real contribution, and what would provide a foundation for us to really build out a program. And it's really sort of to my surprise, in both countries, shellfish restoration is what we entered with. And in Australia, in some ways, it's not that surprising. There was tons going on in the tropics, almost nothing going on in the temperate southern coast of Australia. And they also had lost all their shellfish. And that program took off like, they accomplished in like 5 years what we had accomplished in 10 or 15 years. Within 5 years after their first demonstration project, they had demo projects in every southern province. They had convinced the government to start a national reef rebuilder program where they got granted $20 million to get 60 reefs going around the country, with, again, this idea of building back the reef, creating jobs, benefiting the communities. And their goal is to bring back the reef so it's 30% of historical levels. So it's really the biggest and only national goal that I know of for shellfish reef restoration at scale, and they're extraordinary. In New Zealand, it was the same story, but it was with mussels, and there I am doing my bit, shoveling in mussels. But again, that entry strategy of working on something where TNC had a lot of experience elsewhere, there was interest in the country, but not that experience, was a very, very good way to kind of establish a new organization there. So finally, and those are just a very few vignettes, if you will, of some of the work we did in at the Nature Conservancy. And my original charge was that TNC really become committed to marine conservation. And this is the most recent ocean goal that the Conservancy has. And why I'm showing this picture is because this young woman was just hired as the current global lead for marine conservation. And in some ways, her story mirrors Elyn's, that she started working for the Nature Conservancy as a volunteer grad student when I started there. And after a 20-year career at TNC doing all kinds of different ocean projects, she's now the global lead, and I can't think of better hands to have that baton in than Lizzie's. So when I retired finally in 2018, I didn't want to stop doing conservation because I really liked what I was doing. So I still, I was lucky to be a trustee for the Rhode Island TNC until I moved to Vermont, and now I'm involved with Vermont TNC. But I joined the board of Island Conservation, which works exclusively on islands and primarily on island restoration and restoring islands, starting with eradication of predators, including rats. So this was all new to me, but very tangible, and I really liked the tangibleness of it. I also liked that when you did remove predators, islands really came back. But of course, I'm an ocean person, so what I wanted them to start doing was to look at how removing predators and restoring islands, what's the benefits to the ocean. So again, my GSO network helped me out. Margaret Linen, who probably all of you know, who is a GSO alum, faculty, dean, is now, I think, the vice provost at UC San Diego, thank you, and Scripps. And so she helped me get a partnership with Scripps going, where we did a global look at benefits to marine systems from island rat eradications and restoration and rewilding. And indeed, the benefits are pretty significant, largely mediated through enhanced bird populations and other connector species that like land crabs that put a lot of larvae in the ocean, but live on land, and a whole variety of other connections. And that partnership also looked at what are the island characteristics that make restoration most valuable to the marine environment. So we were pretty excited by that information. And since I was, we also like the idea of challenges. So at our ocean conference, which is a big annual conference where countries get together, there was one in Palau in April of 22. We, with partners, launched the Island Ocean Connection Challenge to restore and rewild 40 globally significant island ocean ecosystems from ridge to reef by 2030. Again, setting goals really attracts interest, and already we have 8 islands that are part of it. Another 9 will be announced probably by the end of the year, including islands in the Galapagos and Tonga and French Polynesia, some in New Zealand. So it's really exciting to see this sort of land-sea connection and the
Did you restore cohorts in Great South Bay?
Say again?
Did you restore the cohorts?
So it's a really interesting, there's definitely more than there were, but as with all these stories, it's complicated. You know, so the
Yes.
cohort started, as you well know, this cohort started coming back. I'm trying to remember, some fish, I can't remember what, Jeremy will probably know. So started eating all the baby cohorts, even in the sanctuaries. And then, you know, so you have ecosystem impact. And then they started having some fisheries on those fish. So the clams are coming back, and but not, they're not like fully restored. And I think even more interesting is they've been doing sediment profiles every year, and just the overall benthic community has changed dramatically within the closed areas, including more cohorts, but just more benthic in fauna, more structure. And then the other thing that happened is there was a lot of excitement built around Great South Bay. And the real issue there, besides over-harvesting of clams, is, you know, nutrient input to the bay. And kind of starting with that kind of very tangible action made it easier to start talking about some of the harder problems like nutrient pollution. And first in the county, and I was talking with someone from there just a couple of weeks ago. New York State now has quite a, Long Island and New York State has quite a large program now to help people redo their septic systems, just like we do in, you know, in the South Shore, and are starting to work on those bigger problems. So there's more clams, there's less nutrients. Are they all the way there? No. Good job.
Wonderful, and your message of hope is invaluable. It's something I see, you know, state of Rhode Island, state motto or something, always see the highlight wherever we go. I had a question for you about the role of universities in this sort of broader, you highlighted a few in some of the studies that were important. Can you speak to that?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, no, thanks for asking that. So we work a lot with a lot of different universities on a lot of things. At first I thought, well, we have TNC likes to brag they have 800 scientists out of their 4,000 employees. And I thought, oh, they must do everything in-house. Actually, what having all those scientists at TNC does, it makes it way easier to have partnerships with universities because you have collaborators and people who know how to collaborate and people who actually care both about applying it, but also care about publishing and care about things that, drive universities. So we tend not to, so from a global point of view, we tend to work with different universities on different projects. I'd say in different state programs or country programs, they'll have long histories of working with certain universities more than others, and almost all TNC chapters, and certainly the TNC Global Board, always have academic scientists on their as trustees who really identify opportunities to work with universities. So I can't count how many universities we've worked with, but we've worked with, even in the programs I led or was involved in, a lot. And I would say dialogue with, I was asking you about Micronesia, for example. It's nothing, but we have something going on in Micronesia. You have something going on in Micronesia. Let's talk.
Yes. Thank you.
Leslie.
Yeah, just because it's a little bit different, is there some interest in your work looking at with the pest eradication, and you said you wanted, obviously there would be some benefits on the terrestrial part of the island, but that you were looking at what the benefits might be to the marine part of the environment around the island. What did you find?
Yeah, so, land and sea is always connected, and looking at how it's connected is something, many people in this room spend a lifetime doing. But one of the nice things about some of these small islands, it's almost like a mesoplasm. And so they look at a couple of ways. A lot of these islands have large colonies of marine birds, and then you have large amounts of guano, right? And so that's an obvious one, and that provides nutrients to the water. So, and then around oceanic islands, nutrients are limiting. It's not like here where we have too many nutrients, but the coral reefs around oceanic islands, for example, they found were growing, I can't remember the exact amount, but some percentage faster. You had more fish production in islands that had rats removed and therefore large amounts of birds. The other thing that in some ways were more surprising to me, some animal, things like lambcats, which there's a lot of in a lot of these islands, have oceanic larval stages, and then they come back on land, kind of like frogs, in our ponds. And those larval stages will have like blooms, and they'll bring like manta rays and all kinds of
things close to the islands when they're there. So now with this under this challenge and with this partnership with Scripps, we have 3 island systems that we're doing Island Conservation is doing the terrestrial monitoring, Scripps is doing the marine monitoring, and we'll sort of do it much more, having it all planned out in advance versus most of the existing data is, oh, we did this, here's what happened on land, here's what we see on sea. There was one kind of seminal study in the Chagos where they really looked at rat-free and non-rat-free islands, and that's where the numbers of how fast the coral reefs grew came from. Don.
I'm afraid to ask this question, but
Go for it.
there's something different about the green program, as you described, how TNC is collaborating, self-conscious about entering both in a country to work with the government, with the locals. It's just my observation in working on the coastal management side over several decades that the international NGOs are unaccountable to anyone. They can be very arbitrary. We've had several projects where in the middle, and even I'll say TNC did this to us once, in the middle of a long-term effort, they would change direction and stop funding all of the local partners that we were trying to help build up. Is that I don't know
Yeah.
how strong a view,
Yeah,
but it seems to me that at some level, international NGOs, who are they accountable for?
Oh, they're accountable,
And
yeah.
I'm just noticing that I'm seeing a different philosophy and strategy on the marine side that, I'm not saying it's reflective of CRC's wished for practice, but it seems different than
Yeah.
my experiences with international NGOs that seem very arbitrary and capricious in
Yeah.
how they enter countries and then how
Yeah.
they decide to continue or not.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that a reflection of reality?
Yeah, it's like, can you hold two disparate thoughts in your mind at the same time? What you're saying definitely happens. I mean, NGOs are responsible to their boards and their donors. I mean, that's kind of who they're responsible. Do they change tax at some time? Absolutely. I mean, I've seen it in Galapagos, you know, where WWF, TNC once had large programs and now don't have large programs. You know, and that's just one place. And you know, that definitely happens. So when a lot of why it happens can be changes, just like with AID projects, changes in funding that happen, changes in strategy, you know, at the highest level, big organizations, there's always some disconnects between the very top and the field. So I think it certainly in the programs I led, I brought a lot of my philosophy from the Coastal Resources Center and did my darndest to make sure they happened in the programs that I had. I had some ability to affect, but what you're saying happens also. But I think that can be said for in international development projects in general. I'd say the other thing, though, I think that moderates it is that in the last 10 years or so, or maybe longer than that, TNC country programs, and I suspect this is true of other large NGOs, have country trustees. So like the New Zealand program has New Zealand trustees, the Australia program has Australia trustees, and they're the ones who are sustaining it. Typically, the developing countries did not have trustees who were focused on their program. That's changing also, and I think that helps to moderate it because they're, you know, they're authorities, they're highly placed, they're champions above the kind of worker bees. All right, so thank you.
We're going to wrap up, but I don't know if Lynne has time to chat with anyone if you want to, but thanks for coming.
Yeah.
Thank you to Lynne.
Thank you.
That was nice.
Was that good?
Yeah.
Okay. It was nice to meet you.